another dimension.
Many stories in the Twilight Zone resonated with audiences thanks to the deeper meanings interwoven by the show's creator, Rod Serling. For example, in The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, the threat of alien invaders served as a commentary on the dangers of mob mentality, prejudice, and McCarthyism. In other episodes set against the backdrop of war, Serling, who was a veteran himself, mixed in similar unique storytelling devices. However, the episode we'll be discussing today, Death's Head Revisited, is very different. Although this dark tale does include a supernatural element, this time around Serling strayed from overt parables or metaphors. This episode is a far more direct exploration of the aftermath of the Holocaust, and more specifically, the evil behind the carnage. Death's Head Revisited is episode 9 from season 3. It was directed by Don Medford, and it was written by Rod Serling.
Mr. Schmidt recently arrived in a small Bavarian village which lies 8 miles northwest of Munich. A picturesque, delightful little spot, one time known for its scenery, but more recently related to other events having to do with some of the less positive pursuits of man. Human slaughter, torture, misery, and anguish. Mr. Schmidt, as we will soon perceive, has a vested interest in the ruins of a concentration camp. For once, some 17 years ago, his name was Gunther Lutze. He held the rank of a captain in the SS. He was a black uniformed, strutting animal whose function in life was to give pain. And like his colleagues of the time, he shared the one affliction most common amongst that breed known as Nazis. He walked the earth without a heart.
Death's Head Revisited is one of the more serious Twilight Zone entries I've covered so far. This is a story firmly rooted in the horrors of the real world. Up front, we're introduced to Gunther Lutz, as portrayed exceptionally well by Oscar Beregi Jr. Gunther is a former Nazi SS captain, and he's one of the more notorious figures from the era. Although he's using a false name, a hotel receptionist quickly recognizes him during check-in.
You remind me of someone.
Oh?
During the war.
Go on.
We learn that Gunther fled to South America for his crimes against humanity, but clearly he's still very much the same sadistic person.
Was it a prison or something you had here?
Something of the sort, sir.
Was it a prison?
A concentration camp.
A concentration camp.
As Gunther prods this woman about things he already knows the answers to, it's obvious he relishes making her dredge up the nightmares of the past. This tense opening sets the tone perfectly for the chilling story that lies ahead. On that note, I found it fitting that in the opening narration, there is no ambiguity as to how Rod Serling feels about Gunther Lutz or the Nazi party that he represents. Serling openly describes Gunther's past as a black uniformed strutting animal with no heart. Serling himself was Jewish, so this was a story that was personal. Also of note, for this episode, Rod Serling was influenced by real-world events of the time. The lead character was inspired by a former SS Lieutenant Colonel, Adolf Eichmann, credited as the architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann was responsible for the mass deportation of millions of Jews to Nazi extermination camps. During this period, in the 1960s, when Rod Serling was writing for the Twilight Zone series, Eichmann featured prominently in the media. He was on trial for his war crimes. Needless to say, an event of such historic significance prompted Serling to offer his perspective on the matter.
The camp, it's that group of buildings up on the hill, isn't it?
It is indeed. But most of us would like it burned to the ground.
This glaring question, why is the concentration camp still standing, is important. It's an issue that lingers throughout the narrative, and eventually, it's something that we circle back to. Gunther soon finds his way back to the ruins of his old concentration camp, and it's here that we get several disturbing scenes. He takes a moment and admires the gallows. He finally recalls his days torturing prisoners. As fans of this episode have pointed out, Gunther revisiting his past in this nostalgic manner is basically a twisted version of Walking Distance. In that classic episode, Martin Sloan also revisited his past for a sentimental trip down memory lane. Gunther's revisit to the past, however, is far more disturbing. He's a monster that's become so warped he longs for the power he once had. Eventually, Gunther encounters a mysterious man who interrupts his trip down memory lane.
Good afternoon, Captain, and welcome back.
He attempts to flee, but finds himself locked inside.
Alfred Becker. I remember you.
And well, you should.
Even though it's suggested that Becker is the caretaker, we as viewers get the hint that Becker is likely far more than that. Alfred Becker is played here by distinguished character actor Joseph Schildkraut. And once these two men are reunited, the direction of this story becomes very clear. Gunter is told he must face trial for the unspeakable crimes he's committed against humanity.
Shall we go? The court is waiting.
From here on out, director Don Medford plunges us into dark territory. Gunter finds himself surrounded by a ghostly jury, which is comprised of his many victims.
Indictment 5, that he did sign and put into effect specific orders passing 3 million.
This entire sequence is both haunting and disorienting. Medford expertly keeps things moving at a brisk pace. And most importantly, the sequence features a brilliant conversation between Gunter and Becker.
You didn't bury them deep enough, Captain. You didn't cover them up with enough earth. Or perhaps the bullets were too small a caliber, or the flames not sufficiently hot, or perhaps there wasn't enough gas.
I think the most revealing aspect in these moments is the contrast between the two leads. Becker remains somber but steadfast. However, Gunter falls apart.
Biggs! Phil! You will all assemble in the square!
It's also interesting that, as the episode unfolds, Gunter offers nothing in the way of regret. Instead, he trots out justifications for his heinous actions. Initially, he tries to downplay his crimes by saying what happened was long ago. Later, he offers up the defense that he was just following orders, an all too common plea made by many accused members of the Nazi Party during the Nuremberg trials. And it was also the defense of Adolf Eichmann. Within the context of this story, Gunter's denial of any personal responsibility is flimsy to say the least. And his defense is entirely undone by the fact that the reason he's even revisiting his concentration camp is because he longs for the days when he was in power. He's nostalgic for the times that he humiliated, tortured, and sentenced countless victims to their death. So, how is it that Gunter can be both proud of his past actions, but also claim no responsibility for the genocide he took part in orchestrating? In this way, I think Serling cleverly dismantles the Nuremberg defense.
Why didn't I kill you when I had a chance? Why didn't I?
Ultimately, it's revealed that Becker too is a ghost, and more specifically, he was the final victim of Gunter. Shortly thereafter, Gunter is found guilty for crimes against his fellow man. His punishment is the loss of his sanity. And with that, he begins to writhe in pain as he's forced to suffer in the same manner as those that died by his hands.
Your final judgment will come from God.
Later, a doctor tends to the mentally shattered Gunter, and he's officially deemed insane. The episode concludes on a thought-provoking note as we once again touch on the same question that was pondered up front.
Why does it still stand? There is an answer to the doctor's question. All the Dachaus must remain standing. The Dachaus, the Belsens, the Buchenwalds, the Auschwitzes. All of them. They must remain standing because they are a monument to a moment in time when some men decided to turn the earth into a graveyard. Into it they shoveled all of their reason, their logic, their knowledge, but worst of all, their conscience. And the moment we forget this, the moment we cease to be haunted by its remembrance, then we become the gravediggers. Something to dwell on and to remember. Not only in the Twilight Zone, but wherever men walk God's earth.
There we have it, Death's Head Revisited. A very powerful and moving episode, and it's another one of the more important entries in the series. This may be a tough watch for some, but I think it's well worth viewing. I also think the conclusion is fitting. I was expecting some form of cosmic justice, but rather than a swift death, Gunter remains alive to endure a far more grueling punishment. As fellow Twilight Zone fans know, Rod Serling touched on this subject again in the 4th season episode He's Alive, but he also revisited the subject in The Escape Route, which was one of 3 stories in his collection of novellas in The Season to Be Wary. The Escape Route was later adapted into a segment on Night Gallery, which starred Richard Kiley as a Nazi war criminal who finds solace in a painting. Again, this was clearly a topic that Rod Serling had strong feelings about. And keep in mind, Back in the 1960s, the aftermath of World War II was still relatively recent. Plus, the ongoing trial of Adolf Eichmann only brought all of that history right back to the forefront. That said, it's pretty significant that Serling was able to tell his story in a manner that was more direct than other entries in the Twilight Zone. Don Medford's direction here was perfect. The atmosphere throughout was somber and haunting, yet the entire affair was presented with an energy and distinct vision.
Now you come back to your scenes of horror, and you wonder that the misery that you planted has lived after you.
Lastly, I wanted to highlight the stellar performances from our leads, both of whom were Jewish themselves.
Don't ask the impossible, Captain Lutzer. Do not ask forgiveness from those whom you have destroyed to a point past forgiveness.
Joseph Schildkraut was excellent in his role as Becker, the face and voice of Gunther's victims. You can't help but feel the enormity and weight of the suffering on his shoulders. We would see Schildkraut again in the Twilight Zone in the episode The Trade-Ins. And he had quite the career. He achieved success early on in silent films, and he would go on to win an Oscar for The Life of Emile Zola, and he was nominated for a Golden Globe for his role in The Diary of Anne Frank. And of course there's Oscar Beregi Jr., who also gave a very strong performance. I'd say he was downright eerie during his nostalgic moments, but for my money he really shined during his conversation with Becker.
You will pronounce sentence, and then you shall execute that sentence. Is that correct?
Oscar Beregi Jr. was also a Twilight Zone veteran. He appeared in the Season 4 episode Mute, and he also appeared in the Rip Van Winkle caper, an episode I happened to catch more than a few times during Twilight Zone marathons. Beregi may be familiar to some for his part in such films as Young Frankenstein, but he's most known for his work on the small screen.
What is this noise?
Strange that it should disturb you so it never used to, Captain.
Again, I understand this episode may be a tough watch for some, but I still highly recommend it. It's a powerful story of morality, justice, and retribution, and it will remain with you for some time. I'd rate Death's Head Revisited 5 out of 5. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you've seen this episode and have your own thoughts on it, feel free to drop a comment below. Take care, stay safe, and be well.